So welcome to our third Bible Feed live webinar, which is on the subject of is now a good time to read the Bible? And I'd like to extend a warm welcome to John and Dan. Good evening.
Good evening, Paul.
Enjoying the sunshine this weekend?
Dan certainly looks like he's enjoyed the sunshine today, doesn't he?
Very good. So, well, I hope everyone that's logging in is staying safe and continuing. I know it gets a bit tedious, but continuing to observe the lockdown arrangements and provisions that we have in place at the moment. Staying safe and staying well. So our subject this evening is now a good time to read the Bible. Let's just do a quick recap of the first two sessions. One of them was why read the Bible, and the second one was how read the Bible. So under why, we looked at some important points about how the Bible leads us to Jesus, and that's really the point of it. And it's leading us to some of the big themes, the grand narrative of what God is trying to do with human beings and through. But we also saw that it's about instructing us in righteousness, that we might be mature and leading us to do good works, whatever that might be. And then in the second one, how do we read the Bible? We looked at all sorts of things. Some advice on where to start. Start with the gospel was one of the suggestions, but look at all the different parts of the Bible. Important to ask the right questions as you read that are relevant to the context of the passage and the genre, and to read it regularly, not in great big chunks, but bite-sized chunks. And that was some of the advice we saw in that session. So this time we're asking this question: is now the right time? Is now a good time to read the Bible? So I'm going to lead us through that and see what John and Dan think about that. See what they can say about that. So I suppose we'll start off with thinking about what you need to be motivated to do something like read the Bible. It's not a small task. I think, John, you gave us some stats last time. What was it? 30-odd thousand verses, longer than Lord of the Rings, was it?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not a small task. And you're not going to do it overnight. So you need to be motivated to get into it, put some effort into it. And what motivates us to do anything, for me, it's usually the realization that there's a problem and I've got to deal with it. And I'm thinking of pretty common things like, I run around the block and I'm wheezing like mad, and I realize this is not good. I've got to get fit. I've got to do something. I realize there's a problem, or I step on the scales and oh dear. Normally there's something brings to light there's a problem, and you've got to solve. You've got to find a solution. You've got to work on that solution. So I suspect it's a little bit like that with the Bible. So let's ask John first of all. So can you give me an insight into what motivates you to pick up your Bible and read it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess for me, there's probably lots of different reasons about why I would end up reading. There's probably some that are I've read it for a long time and it's a bit of a habit and that kind of thing. I suppose on another level, I think I'm probably a reasonably curious chap. I think the Bible's claim that it's a revelation from God is quite a big one, and given I'm a follower of Jesus and I believe the resurrection and so on, the ability to gain an insight into a divine mind is a big part of why you'd read a book like the Bible. But I guess the question here is why someone might pick it up now, isn't it? Like, rather than maybe if they've done something for years. And I think for me, one of the things that would sing to that point is that the Bible, in my view, diagnoses the nature of humanity, I suppose. Does that concept make sense? Should I expand on that a
bit? The nature of humanity. I mean, that covers all sorts of aspects. I mean, what do you mean by that? Is that a physical thing or a psychological or behavioural or society? What
I
do you
think
mean
it's
by that?
probably a bit of all of that. I'll give an example like right now that I think highlights the kind of the nature of human beings. So right at the moment, in the current crisis, there is the most brilliant work happening by scientists and researchers to try and develop a vaccine for something like COVID. That often I think will be motivated out of really, really good motives, and it is a quite incredible when it comes, and I'm sure it will, is an absolutely incredible human achievement. But equally, at the same time, maybe this happened maybe a couple of weeks ago, you get some quite selfish actions as well. Things like when it was clear that the lockdown was coming, there was a lot of this kind of panic buying that people did, which in one sense is you can understand why people do it, but it actually hits the poorest in society, and that sort of thing. So I think when you kind of reflect deeply on humanity, and I'm an optimist, so I always like to think that people are always doing good things, but they're not. I think there's a bit of good and a bit of bad. The curate's egg kind of analogy seems to work, and I think the biblical texts do a really fair reflection of that. So there's often actions of great love and kindness, but within the same characters it paints great flaws. And so this concept that actually humanity is neither sort of flawless and brilliant or always terrible, it paints that really accurately, I think. And often in the heroes it paints, people like King David in the Old Testament, who does amazing things, he's also painted as very flawed human. And so I guess in that I probably see myself as well, that actually there is, I hope, some good things I do, but equally some major flaws in the way I am and the way I behave. And so that kind of honesty, I suppose, means that I think the Bible accurately reflects what humanity is like. So and I suppose, does that make sense?
Yeah, so it's a bit like, you're looking in a mirror, it's holding up a mirror to yourself and realizing that the way you feel and think about stuff and life,
I think that's a good
other people have been there before.
Exactly, and the Bible does use the concept of Scripture as a bit like a mirror in a passage in James, so that's a good picture, I think. And I guess for me as well, another reason why that motivates me to read the Bible is often in the biblical text you get individuals of faith reflecting on that. So you'll often, like a book like the Psalms, which is a long book in the middle, piece of poetry, often is very sort of heart-wrenching reflections on people's situations and challenges and problems and hopes and fears. And in that, you see, I think this is something you could say, and Dan may comment on this in a second, throughout Scripture, you see people behaving as humans and having a relationship with God, and that gives me comfort and challenge and all that kind of thing. So I think for me, what would motivate me now to read is that I think the Bible actually does a really good job of reflecting what humanity is. And also, I think maybe we'll come on to this a bit later, how God intends to solve some of the bigger problems.
I suppose that's what you'd expect if God is the creator, you'd expect him to be able to understand and reveal deep insights into what he's made. That's
exactly that, and he would know it best, wouldn't he?
Yeah. So it's a bit more than just natural curiosity. There's that aspect of this tension, if you like, between humans being flawed but able to do good things, able to rise above that. Okay, that's great. So let's see what Dan's perspective is on this question. So as you pick up the Bible, what problem do you see the Bible, reading the Bible, as solving? Give us some thoughts on that.
John's touched on a few things already, hasn't he, about sort of portraying humanity in a certain way, as in showing their selfishness, flaws, and so on, which I think is there. But there's actually, I suppose you could categorize it as two issues, two problems, really, if we want to sort of try and segregate them. And the first is sort of more fundamental than that. It gets right back to the point or the question of, why are we here in the first place? What is the point of all this? What is the meaning of existence, of life? And life that ends in death, then seemingly that's it. And actually, the Bible is so the different parts of the Bible is that they're so honest again on this. They spell it out in such a sort of raw fashion. So, for example, the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament, one of those wisdom literature books of sort of ancient Hebrew wisdom, which is a terrifically up-to-date piece of literature. It's incredible how it describes the sort of meaningless of day-to-day existence, and it's basically written by the preacher or the teacher, whoever he is, and he sort of described or portrays himself as a sort of King Solomon persona, as someone who's done everything, someone who has been to the top, he's reached at the top. So, you know, he says in the first chapter, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my heart to seek to search out wisdom and all that's done under heaven. He acquired great wisdom, verse 16, chapter 2, he says, come now, I'll test you with pleasure, enjoy yourself. To himself, I said to my heart, come now, I'll test you with pleasure, enjoy yourself. And the whole book is this figure, this character, you know, thinking, right, I will try and learn everything I can learn. I'll try and have the most power that I can have. I'll try and have the most pleasure that I can have. I'll try and do everything I can. And basically, the answer is, well, verse 9, I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatsoever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, but my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity, a waste of time, and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. And it's the sort of typical kind of, you know, CEO of a great big, you know, blue chip company who declares that actually they've got so many things and yet they don't feel fulfilled, they're not satisfied. And, you know, part of the reason is because that, well, the rest of the book just goes on and on. And
so those things are not, they're not meaningful in any lasting sense.
No.
I mean, is there anything in that book of Ecclesiastes that does emerge as being meaningful?
Well, what it sort of points, what it points to, the reason things aren't meaningful is because we all end up, you know, turning to dust again, basically. it's
right.
Very morbid. Yeah. So, you know,
cheery old book, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very cheery. Yeah. Yeah. That we will all end up as dust, we're the same as the animals, and off we go. And, you know, it sort of really focuses your mind. And I think this is the point of the book. It focuses on your mind on, okay, what actually is important with life? What is the point of life? Which is what it's, you know, designed to do. And there's a sort of a conclusion at the end that sort of says, actually, here's the conclusion: fear God and, you know, turn to God. Which, you know, that's, you might think, or, you know, the average person might think that's a big jump to make, to sort of suddenly bemoan the whole world that there's no point or purpose to life. Okay, therefore I'll turn to God. There's a bridge to cross for sure, but it's sort of saying, look, there is no sort of, this feels like a meaningless universe. Is there purpose? Is there something in this? Perhaps it is God.
And yet there's something in the human psyche, if you like, which is wanting things to be meaningful.
Oh, definitely, yeah. I mean, the very fact that the book exists, that, you know, the very fact that we ask that question, you know, throughout history, we sort of say, well, where have I come from and where am I going? What's the point of life?
Yeah,
it means something to us because we ask it. So,
and all it seems to, I think it mentions some, you know, take some pleasure in, you know, a meal or a relationship with a loved one, and those kind of things. Which
it does, but it's hard to tell whether or not it's being a bit sarcastic, because it says, you know, work as hard as you can, because there's no work to do when you're dead in the grave. You know, that kind of kind of almost dry wit, maybe.
Okay, but thankfully that book is not the whole story.
No.
So I think you said there were two problems.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So that first problem is kind of, you know, mortality, meaningless of existence. Okay, and so the second problem is the fact, which is really what Johnson touched on as well, is that humanity messes up, humanity fails, people fail, and really the Bible, that's the wide narrative of the Bible. The Old Testament talks all about that, people repeatedly sort of failing. There's so many things in the Psalms, poems about sort of talking about the inherent sort of selfishness of people, of the psalmist himself, of that sort of thing. And then you get to the prophets, and the prophets are sort of prophetic oracles against the injustices of the nation of Israel at the time, all throughout, how that people are mistreated all the time, power being abused, and then you get, you know, all the way into the sort of teaching of Jesus, where Jesus really sharply brings us into focus by sort of diagnosing that, you know, what defiles a person, what makes a person sort of unclean in the eyes of God, or what makes a person, what is bad about people. It's not sort of washing your hands. Right now we do that for a good reason, but the real sort of source of you know, evil of that sort of thing, the opposite of good, is things that come out of the heart of people. So there's an inherent sort of
where does Jesus say that?
So there's probably a few occasions, but so Mark 7 is one of those. I mean, he talks a lot to the Pharisees as well in other places, but Mark 7, he says, what comes out of a person is what defiles him, for from within, out of the heart of man come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, etc. All these things come from within, they defile a person.
So when I was asking John about, is this, you know, understanding of humanity, of it, is it physical, is it psychological? It's actually a bit of both. There is the physical issue of mortality that needs solving, and the problem that brings in terms of futility or impermanence, and then there's the psychological side of things as well. So, you know, I can see those as pretty major problems. So let's get back to you, Dan. So for you, how does reading the Bible help?
That's a big question. So just, I mean, extremely briefly, because we'll sort of unpack more detail, I suppose. But so two problems that I've sort of tried to say. I mean, to some extent, they're interrelated, I guess, as much as, you know, your mortality makes you selfish because you've got the survival instinct, etc., etc. But these two issues. Well, the Bible claims that there is a God who can defeat death, who can overcome mortality and present life that can continue. So that, you know, that's a clear sort of resolution to the first one, and then the second one really, I mean, again, it's all sort of wrapped up with this, is that Jesus comes along the scene. So the whole Old Testament narrative talks so much about or exposes sort of the human condition in such a way that when Jesus enters on the scene, and things that he does, the things that he teaches, and then ultimately his sort of crucifixion, his death, they reach into the human conscience in a way so much more powerful than anything else could have done, and that, you know, Jesus is the solution in some way. I'm gonna leave it there.
We'll get into that in a little bit more detail shortly, I guess. But you know, the way you've described the problem that, you know, coming to the Bible, and the Bible's there to solve, as mortality and this kind of more internal issue of, you know, human beings just misbehaving and actually not doing things very well a lot of the time, even though they can do good. You know, if the Bible has the solution to that, why isn't everybody desperate to read this? Is a kind of obvious question that springs to mind. So maybe I can ask each of you just to give a bit of a thought on that, and I'll come to you first, John. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I suppose on a really practical level, the question you've asked is, why isn't everyone reading the Bible if it solves these problems? I think really practical answer is not everyone has come across the Bible. I mean, it is the best-selling book in the world, bar none, but still people haven't heard it in certain parts of the world. And I guess for other people, they have either another faith or have no faith and actively would reject it, I guess often without getting even into the detail. That's the kind of practical answer about why that hasn't. But I think the question behind the question is a really big one, which is, why has God not chosen to make it more obvious that he's got the solution? I guess that's the real question here, isn't it?
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah.
Why isn't it slapping people in the face a bit more than it does?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think my and it would only be a tentative answer here, because I think we have to tread quite carefully on this kind of question, because I think the real answer is we probably don't know, but I think we can probably hint at what might be going on. And I think the for me at least, it would seem that when you read scripture, and the way that God shows himself through Jesus, God doesn't often choose to be coercive in the way he interacts with humanity. Right. He does sometimes, but in the main he doesn't. And I think that's probably intentional. The way he chooses to speak, it would seem, and this is from a Christian worldview, either through things like nature, which everyone can access, but he does choose to reveal himself through a person in Jesus and through a book, scripture, the Bible in this instance, none of which are really coercive or anywhere near coercive. There's like a voice in everyone's ear saying, you must believe in me. And I think that the reason that might be the case is because it's very rare that coercion and love are sort of, you ever find them together. If you think about a coercive human relationship, it's very rare that there would be true love involved, because by its nature, someone has a very obvious coercive power over the other. And I think given what we read and understand about God wanting a loving response, it would seem to me that the way he's designed it is so that the answers are there for people who seek after it, but it's not something that he's almost, if you to use language I don't intend to use, like ramming it down people's throats kind of thing. There's enough for people who want to find it, but there's not so much that everyone feels oppressed by it. Does that make sense? I'll be interested to hear what Dan thinks on this, but that's really interesting. A suggestion as to why that's the case.
And coercion, often those kind of relationships are more characterized by fear than
precisely
by love. Yeah, Dan, let's.
I think I tend to agree, and probably maybe a step further in that the Bible itself, by its own admission, shows that having a more of a coercive or a rule-based approach of a relationship doesn't work. So, for example, the Old Testament again is just grand narrative of the Old Testament that describes this nation who had God's laws, God's revelation to them, things open and obvious, etc. And yet the whole point of that is that, well, this doesn't really work. Rules-based way of running a relationship between God and people isn't really solving the root problem of sort of humanity's selfishness, etc. So you take that to today, and so people sort of say, well, what if God's real? Why doesn't he just appear to everyone in the world and sort of, or write a message in the sky and say, this is the book you need to read, this, and everyone will know then, and then they'll read it, and then that'll be fine. And actually, but by the Bible's own admission, that wouldn't really work. It's not.
So in a way, part of that narrative is demonstrating that on occasions God has done that, and almost the point of that is to demonstrate that it doesn't work. It doesn't produce the loving relationship.
Yeah. Could I just add to that as well? I guess a really, really interesting example of that would be that Jesus came and Jesus claimed that he was showing God, and I think we would accept that that's the case. So that's a really good example. And he was known to do miracles and be a brilliantly kind of loving individual, and yet the people killed him. So, so the idea that a very visible showing of what God was like still didn't mean that everyone suddenly went, we love God, we want to follow him, in that sense. So I think that was
a really good point.
Tied to this point as well.
And
actually it goes back to this point around, like, what is humanity really like? Well, when it sees brilliance like Jesus, what does it do with it?
Yeah, that's it doesn't cover itself in glory necessarily.
Not really, no.
Yeah. Okay. So that, I mean, that. Anything else to add, Dan, or are we good?
No, I don't think. I mean,
yeah.
That's pretty much. I mean, it's a whole bigger.
I know. I was just kind of thinking this. I think we've hit a rich vein here that you know we could mine for some time. You know, and maybe it's a topic we'll pick up on a future session about, you know, the deliberate arrangement that involves free will and people genuinely having a choice. The message is there, but we've got to choose to pay attention to it, and how that leads to something more significant and a more meaningful relationship with God potentially. So yeah, maybe we'll pick that up as a separate session. So we've talked quite a bit about problems, and you know your reasons, John and Dan, for coming to the Bible and reading the Bible to get a perspective on some of the problems with mortality and human character and behaviour. And we've talked before about the grand narrative of the Bible, but in pretty vague terms, like, you know, wanting humans to reflect the image of God. So let's see if we can drill down in and clarify some of the solutions to these problems. So Dan, first of all, I mean, you talked about the Bible bringing us to Jesus. We've said it a few times, I think, between us now. So why do you think that Jesus is a solution to these problems?
So yeah, big questions tonight. But let's try and summarise that as best as I can. So there's these two issues then we've talked about. An issue about mortality, that problem, and then a problem about, well, humanity's sort of inherent selfishness and sinfulness, etc. So by sort of fundamentally, Jesus being the solution to the problem of mortality, the fact that we die and we stay dead, that comes in his resurrection. So for example, a very key chapter in 1 Corinthians 15, which talks a lot about Jesus and his resurrection. It talks about, you know, some of the witnesses that had seen Jesus, and invites the Corinthians to sort of go off and talk to them and hear their story, because some of the people at the time, they were sort of skeptical, or they were denying that the resurrection was going to happen for believers. And Paul here is effectively arguing against that. Right. So he talks about the resurrection of Jesus, and you know, here's an example, verse 20. In fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For as by man came death, by man has come also the resurrection. As in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. So really, sort of simply, Jesus brings the solution to mortality, because he is the one who God has raised from the dead, and therefore those who sort of basically say, look, I don't want to be like humanity, I don't want to be like Adam, the rest of humanity, that kind of you know, mass of people. I want to be like Jesus instead. I want to be like him, and then God will sort of grant that promise of resurrection and life with him. So go ahead.
And is there a bit of an indication? I was just looking at the next verse as well, verse 23. A bit of an indication of timing of that resurrection.
So it
talks about Christ, the first fruits, and those that are Christ at his coming.
At his coming, So there's all throughout the New Testament. There's after the Gospels, so all post Jesus and the times of Jesus and his ministry and his death and his resurrection. after that, the New Testament is anticipating Christ coming again. And at that point, the resurrection to sort of be fulfilled in all the sort of faithful to be raised, and a sort of, a furthering or an expanding of God's kingdom to sort of fill the world, and resurrection to happen then. So yeah, there's a time when that is going to happen. There's absolutely no indication of when. But,
but it will happen at a point in time.
Sure.
I guess is the message, and therefore it's now the right time to pick up your Bible.
It
adds a dimension to that.
So it's now the right time to do that when yes, because I guess tomorrow might not be what we think it is. The next day might not be what we think it is. 10 years time might not be, but now is always the time. Now's the right time to do that.
So that's Jesus. His resurrection. I can see how that addresses very directly the problem of mortality. What about the second problem? Is there more to Jesus' work?
So we've got to sort of take a step back with that and think about, well, Jesus, he died. To be resurrected, you have to be killed first. That's by definition, or you have to die. And so we think, okay, how did Jesus die? What happened? And rewind the clock a little bit, and he died because people, just ordinary people, a whole section of society, put him to death and conspired against him and put him to death. So this was from the people in the priests, in the Jewish rulers, the Roman soldiers, the Roman governor, the crowd that wanted him to be put to death. Just the whole, you read through the Gospels, and it's all of them, but maybe particularly Luke, I think, talks about all these different individuals that were sort of there and somehow implicated with the things that happened. And the point is that humanity put Jesus to death. All the best in humanity, there and then at that time, what could they do with this person who came and did good? He healed people, he did miracles, he fed people, he taught people to turn the other cheek, he taught people to not be violent, he all these other things. And what did they do? Well, they killed him. And that puts into focus two things. It puts into focus the absolute sort of depths that humanity can reach. And these weren't especially wicked people or especially bad people. They're people, if I was in that situation, I could well have been, caught up in the same.
So we see something of ourselves in.
Absolutely.
In that.
Yeah, we do. So you see
picture.
You see how, and this is part of Jesus' teaching as well, that, murdering someone is bad, but actually anger is the root cause of what will end up in murder. So, he says, so, if you're angry with your brother, you shouldn't, you need to stop.
And I guess there were all sorts of, it talks about, for envy, they did this, and anger and
jealousy.
So all of those very human things that we know and are familiar with.
Yeah, that's right.
Were what led to that.
Yeah. Have you ever been
injustice?
Yeah. I've felt envy before, I guess, and jealousy, and I felt anger before. So
what do we do with that? So we see ourselves in that. Okay.
Yeah. So that's only one half of the story, though. That's one half of the picture of what's happening, because the other half is the complete opposite. This is Jesus, who hasn't done anything, and yet he doesn't fight back. He doesn't rise up. He doesn't try and demand his rights, demand his his life. Throughout the whole narrative, he's thinking about others. He's thinking about his friends, his disciples. He's thinking about those who are crucifying him by saying, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Whatever we make of that phrase, it's quite amazing. All throughout this, he's acting in a way which is totally the opposite. And so this moment in history, this historical event, which is, you know, it's all it is.
Yeah.
It's man being executed by the Romans all the time. But, you know, this one sort of event in history is kind of the parceling up the whole sort of human problem and presenting the God's solution in Jesus in this little sort of, you know, few events and what happens. And it's that then means it impacts on the conscience, because that's, you know, that's what happens in
well, isn't it in a way, isn't it presenting a choice?
Sure. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, we can either be the people who let our anger, you know, happen, and, you know, the vast majority of people who are angry, they don't go on to do something absolutely terrible like murdering people. But if they spend their life being angry with people all the time, I mean, that's not a happy life, is it? That's not a fulfilled life. It's not reaching humanity's potential of being in the image of God. That's it. So there's that choice, and then the other choice is actually we can choose to be a bit more like Jesus, and then with that comes things like Jesus saying, well, God will forgive your sins, forgive your the errors that you make, and so on, which is absolutely a central part of it. And then that all snowballs into a big sort of motivation to become more like him and choose to follow Jesus. So yeah, there we go. That's summarizing.
I mean, they're big questions.
Big sort of theological discussions have happened about this for the last 2,000 years. But, you know, essentially, that's what it is. This is you know, two different ways of living. Which one are we going to
do? John, do you want to add something to that?
No, Dan did a great job of summarising the theology of Christianity in a nutshell. I guess the only thing I would say is more to the latter point that Dan was making around Jesus shows sort of an incredibly selfless attitude and that kind of thing. That actually there is something really helpful in having someone who you can look to who's shown certain qualities. So take the concept of love, for example. The Bible often talks about God being a God of love and so on. It's actually, I think, sometimes a little bit hard to relate to a God, you know, who's never walked the streets and that kind of thing. Whereas with Jesus, who, as the Bible would teach, is the Son of God, but who was completely human, in that he was like us, and yet showed love and did the most remarkable things for someone who was the Son of God. At the night before he's going to die, he's down on his hands and knees washing the feet of his followers, which is such a radical kind of thought. So I think to that point, actually in the life of Jesus, what, of course, to Dan's points around solving things like mortality and sin and this big concept of salvation, he also shows us the way to live in real, practical, gritty, down-to-earth ways that it means something, like getting a dirty towel out and wiping dirt off his followers' feet, one of whom was about to betray him. You know, that's an incredible example to follow. And there's passages throughout the New Testament. One of my favorite ones is in Peter, and talks about him. He is an example that we can follow his steps. That doesn't mean that we'll do everything the same, but we've got someone to follow who just lived on this earth, who understands what life is like to be human and come through. And I think that's an amazing thing.
That's a great answer. So thanks to you both for that, and that, I guess, leads us on quite nicely into the next question, because Dan has talked about resurrection as the solution for mortality, but that's something, you know, out there in the future. We don't know when. Let's bring it back to the here and now a bit more, and, you know, can we expect some benefits or some solutions to the problems we're experiencing in life now? We touched on it a little bit, but let's just think about that a bit more, John.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think my answer directly would be yes, and not necessarily, I suppose. So the reason I said yes is that Scripture does promise things today, like the peace of God it talks about that passes all understanding, or it promises comfort, and it promises hope, or rest in Jesus. So there's lots of language that we actually talked about. I think it was the first session, was it? Where why do people, was it? I think Danny was the one that you were hosting. why do people read the Bible? For comfort. That was one reason. Sure,
Mm.
definitely the concept of Christianity, Jesus offers those things. And I suppose with that, there's been some useful studies, social studies, to show that actually being a follower of Jesus does bring some level of benefit. So an example would be, so attending, not that we can at the moment, but attending a church group or being part of a church community, scholars have kind of highlighted that actually attending a religious service does increase things like social support. It discourages smoking. It is linked to a decrease in depression. It helps people develop a more optimistic and hopeful outlook on life and that kind of thing. Now, that's not to say that every single believer will realise those benefits.
Yeah, careful what you promise.
Exactly. But there does seem to be on a statistical level a level of benefit that is afforded. Sure. And maybe there is something to the point I was just making, that actually what the life of Jesus shows is this incredible life of compassion and care and service. And if communities of people show those qualities, of course there's going to be massive benefits for that group. And particularly, I'm thinking at the moment, like the elderly, if you're part of a church group, you've got a group who are calling around to the elderly and calling them, that's a massive network and support. And actually, I think what's happened with this kind of NHS responders kind of thing is actually a really lovely thing to do, and actually mirrors probably what many churches were doing anyway, which is a really great thing. So that, yes, on one level, but, and it's a huge but, it doesn't necessarily mean that the followers of Jesus will receive immediate benefits today. And the best example of that is to look at the earliest followers of Jesus, most of whom had a pretty raw deal. Take James, he died, he was killed. Peter was killed, and a lot of the early kind of historical records would play that a lot of early Christians were killed at the hands of the Roman Empire. So, and actually today, probably the most persecuted religious community in the world is people from various Christian groups, particularly in the Middle East and so on. So the idea that like Christianity in and of itself afford life benefits now, and there is certainly strands of Christianity that would advocate a kind of prosperity gospel where you believe Jesus and you get wealth. That is completely no-no, and there's no, as far as I can see, biblical evidence for that. And I guess for us as a community, a Christadelphian community, we've recently seen some extraordinary levels of faith shown by individuals who've come across from Iran, who've been persecuted for their faith. So again, that's why I've said kind of not necessarily. And I think the reason for that, and Hebrews talks to this point, that actually God uses our life to understand our character, and he uses times in our life to learn about what we're like and to let us try and show Jesus in our lives as part of following him. Right. So I've just slightly wordy answer, but should we expect benefits to our life today? Yes, on some level, but not necessarily it's going to make life easy.
I suppose that the yes part of your answer almost derives from the understanding of the bigger picture of, what as human beings are we here for, understanding Jesus, understanding the outworking of God's purpose in resurrection. And okay, that just sometimes helps to put things in perspective.
Precisely exactly that. And if the believers of Jesus are truly following his principles, following in his steps, there should be an awful lot of kindness going around, a lot of love, and a lot of compassion, which is a really lovely thing for a group of people to experience.
And there's a definite here and now benefit in that.
Exactly that.
Great.
Yeah.
Dan, do you want to add any of your perspectives to that?
I think the only thing that just jumps to my mind on this is that this whole recent situation that we've sort of found ourselves in, this lockdown situation. There's a survey done, I think the Guardian reported on it recently, that during this period, I think it's about 1 in 4, so a quarter of UK adults have listened into a religious service, streaming or on demand or whatever, during the last few weeks in lockdown in the UK, which is a bit of a jump, I think, and 1 in 5 of those who've done that have never attended church before, ever.
That's interesting.
It's a fascinating sort of survey, and I guess more surveys on that might be useful because it's perhaps just one. But what that just showed to me was something really interesting, that perhaps intuitively people in a situation that is, well, it's a bit stressful, it's a bit worrying, it's unnerving, it's frankly quite scary, that, you know, everything that we considered as normal has suddenly been turned on its head, and our freedoms have gone. That people have intuitively thought that actually perhaps there's something in religion that can help me through this, or, you know, turn to God, maybe check it out in a bit more detail.
Yeah, and that the link to that article, which I noticed, just gone into the chat for the webinar, so you can take a look at that.
I suppose all it shows is that it isn't a crackpot idea that, you know, turning to God, because actually intuitively a lot of people might think to do that. So
and some of the things.
Go ahead, John. The overall topic tonight is around what is now a good time, and actually it probably is, because like all of our lives have kind of been disrupted, haven't they? We've probably got slightly more time than we normally would to think about these kind of bigger, more existential things. And even like I was chatting to our neighbour the other day, and they were starting to think on a very small level, oh, we might decide we're going to move to live by the sea. Like, people are having much bigger ideas than if you're in the kind of rat race of life. You don't get the time to think and actually to stand back and go, why are we here? What's going on with the world? Like, where's this all going? Is not an unreasonable question to ask. I think at the moment, is it?
Yeah, and some of the things that have seemed so certain about the structure of daily life and what you'd expect to happen and how you'd expect your life to move on and move forward have been shown to be, you know, perhaps not quite so resilient and robust.
Like another example for me would be, if you're in the world of business or something like that, some of the numbers we are seeing now, we have never seen before. So there's a really interesting New York Times front page tomorrow, which is showing the US unemployment figures. And at the top of the chart, the page, it's got all of those kind of metrics, and it's up and down a couple of percent each year. And then it's right the way down the sort of far right of the page, and the number is ridiculous. It's 20 million or something like that. And like, the world is going through these enormous changes. The world won't look the same as it did. And of course, there'll be human solutions to all of these on some level, but it does raise these bigger questions. What's underpinning everything here? But I think are entirely reasonable questions for us all to be asking now.
Yeah, so that leads me very nicely into this question. So if what we've said about the problems that motivate us to come to the Bible in the first place, the solutions that they offer, and just reflecting on the current situation, makes it feel like it's a great time to start to read the Bible. So how does someone get started? How does someone take the first step? Because that's always the hardest. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, so it is said. So give me some ideas that the people listening to this can take on board and can maybe kind of do immediately after this webinar's finished. They can take this first step. So Dan, first of all, what do you think?
Okay, yeah. So we talked a little bit yesterday about where you might start, and I said in the last session, and I said maybe maybe the Gospel of Mark. So I'd sort of say that again. Perhaps start with that, but let's just think about what's the point of reading a gospel. Well, really, everything we've seen starts or hinges on the resurrection of Jesus. That's really the critical foundation point of Christian faith. So start with the resurrection of Jesus, which is of course part of those gospels, part of the New Testament, such as 1 Corinthians 15 as well, other parts of the New Testament that really talk about that, and really get that established, that how the resurrection is something that really can be believed and really can be taken as something that happened, and therefore everything follows on from that. So it's something I've done something on. I've written a small sort of booklet. It's online as well at theholdinhistory.com. So if someone,
I think we'll put that into the chat. So you can
sure.
pick that up.
That'd be good. So straight after this finishes, if someone wants to start straight away, like you say, by all means have a look at that, and that's sort of presenting the resurrection of Jesus, evidence for it, examining it, and saying, well, the conclusion is that actually it makes more sense believing that it happened than anything else, which really is your foundation that underpins everything else. And then I suppose, you know, practically you're going to want to move on with considering the life of Jesus more so with the Gospels. But then for sure, we've talked a lot about the Old Testament as well in these sessions. And the Old Testament's so vital as well, because it really is the context to the life of Jesus, and it's presenting the problems to which he becomes the solution. So, you know, as you get to know Jesus through the New Testament, that will you know, inevitably start to unlock the Old Testament as well. So reading that, you know, whether you're reading using a reading plan or something, which would be a great sort of practical thing to do. Pick up, you know, just start using YouVersion or some kind of reading plan. I mean, there's so many out there. Just pick one and run with it. That would be good.
Cool. Okay, thanks, Dan. John, what do you think?
I think Dan's spot on. There's probably one verse. If people are still in 1 Corinthians 15, there's one verse in there that I think I've often chatted about with people who aren't Christians. So I think it's an absolutely radical verse and claim. It's 1 Corinthians 15, and Paul, who's one of the early followers of Jesus, is talking to this group of believers and explaining how pivotal the resurrection is. And he says, verse 14, if Christ has not been raised from the dead, then our preaching is vain or empty. Your faith is also vain. That is enormous. Paul basically says in one simple verse, if the resurrection of Jesus didn't happen, give up. So there's actually biblical, like a passage in the Bible that says, test this. If you don't think it's true, give up with it. That's enormous. So that's why I think Dan is absolutely spot on to do that. So yeah, I completely agree with that. And I guess the other thing that might be then, I think Dan's right. You'd maybe start thinking about passages to read. I think maybe the Gospel of Mark, we've suggested before, is a good one. And not that these are perfect by any means, but there's some really useful videos out there that kind of can summarize Bible books for you. There's some great ones by the Bible Project that are really visual, just to get you the kind of pattern of what's going on in the book, which is kind of handy.
Sure.
What was your language? Big reading and little reading, or something? Was it Paul?
Small reading? Yes, that's the one. Yeah.
So like big reading, that can be a really good start. Yeah. And then I think one tip that I was given when I was younger is almost like when you're going through, there'll be some verses that you'll just be like, I've got no idea what that means. Jot it down, put a question mark next to it in your margin or on your like tablet or something like that. Note, like, see where it's maybe quoting the Old Testament, to Dan's point, trying to understand what's going on there. And then I don't know, maybe for me, I would probably read something like Luke next and see how it differs with Mark and how it's similar. And then maybe move on to Luke part 2, which is Acts, which tells the story of...
Okay, because it's written by Luke as well.
Exactly that. Yeah. And it's kind of how the gospel, or the good news of Jesus, goes out around the Roman Empire. It's a fascinating historical read, but it shows you how crucial the resurrection of Jesus was. And it spirals out to these other topics that you'll gradually get into. Yeah. So,
and then I suppose in the Acts of the Apostle, you see how that message affected people, which is kind of... if you're coming to the Bible with that in mind, that's
exactly. If at the moment, because of COVID, you're reflecting on your place in the world and that kind of thing, that kind of journey will give you a really rich view of what the earliest believers believed about Jesus and believed what he brought to the world. That for those of us who follow him today find so sort of compelling today.
Yeah. Okay, and I suppose as Dan mentioned, these things are a culmination of the Old Testament, so that, you know, it's still there as a vital part of the whole. And there's quite often references to, you know, it says this happened because it is written in such and such a place, and those are perhaps things to go and then look in the Old Testament and think about how those connections and echoes across the Bible work.
Definitely, I think that's kind of what we were chatting about a bit last week. When you start to spiral into the Old Testament and elsewhere in the New Testament, you need to think about your genre and just be careful with what you don't kind of read it one bit and go, oh, that must mean something dramatic. Like, read it carefully and all those kind of things. But I think that's a really good foundation to start from.
So, the only other
go ahead.
The other thing I was going to say, we sort of talked about, you know, how can people start, and we've given lots of examples of how people can do things individually. on their own. But
Yeah.
you know, a lot of Bible reading, probably the majority in the history of the Bible, has been done in community with people, and I think there's still
That's a good point.
that is the thing to do, to read in the community, to study and learn together. Now, right now, where you are in the world, you can't rock up and join a group of people and do that. But you know, there's things like what we're doing, what we're trying to do here at Bible Feed, and try and allow or open up community of Bible readers to sort of do that. And you know, we're Christadelphians, and there's you know, tons of Christadelphians with things like correspondence courses and online courses and so on, and groups of people that are just trying to do this together. And by all means, we can sort of help put people in touch.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So step one is kind of Mark's Gospel, Mark chapter 1. Just read Mark chapter 1, and go to thehole-in-history.com, and then take it from there.
That would be good to know.
Okay, well, I think we've pretty much arrived at the close of our session. I'm just going to put something up on the screen and share that. So it remains for me to thank John and Dan very much for their involvement in these last few weeks. I've certainly really enjoyed them, whether I've been hosting or participating. You know, given us some really helpful insights, and I hope that everyone that's been listening has enjoyed them as well. So on the screen there's some details, hopefully reasonably easy to remember, as to where to go from here, other than Mark chapter 1. This has been set up by Bible Feed, and there's a Facebook page you can go to, just called Bible Feed. So take a look at that. So anything that we do in future, we haven't got anything immediately planned, but we will be doing other things. So look out there for any more events and material that pops up there that you'll find useful in reading and studying the Bible. Dan mentioned, I think, some reading plans. There's an example of a reading plan on that website there, the openbiblelearning.com, which you can just register and receive that. And that just starts with 1 chapter a day, and is fairly gentle to get you into it. And then if you've just got any other questions or queries or suggestions about what you'd like us to cover on future suggestions, there's an email address there, admin@openbiblelearning.com, that you can use. So I think that's all we have to say, and all we have time for, really. So it remains for me just to say thank you for watching. God bless, and we hope to see you soon. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Paul.